Welcome back to Let's Make a Game. In this episode, I would like to do another game book review. I will be reviewing Six Gun Friday. This is a 200 paragraph adventure which appeared in the Fighting Fantasy fan-made online magazine Fighting Fantasine, which is available for free download at the address which I will give in the description of this video. It was written by Gaetano Abbondanza and it was illustrated by Massimiliano Anadesi. I would assume from those names that the author is Italian, but this is written in English and there's nothing that I saw which would make you think that the person who wrote its first language wasn't English. Gaetano Abbondanza is apparently a at least sort of semi-professional game book author. He has written game books for Tin Man Games, who have done some computer adaptations of old Fighting Fantasy books, I believe, as well as some original titles. Six Gun Friday, as the name suggests, is a Western, and Italians have or Westerns have been popular in Italy for a long time. The reason we have the phrase spaghetti Western is because that was a sort of slightly derisive, originally derisive, but probably now neutral term to refer to Westerns that were made by Italian producers, usually shot in Spain. And there are there's quite a long series. There are quite long series of Western comics and novels made in Italian in Italy as well. So it's a genre that's sort of more international than you might think, because it's obviously sort of very American and sort of about an idea of America and, of course, set in America. But the genre is surprisingly influenced by people who aren't American, and has a surprisingly large following in countries outside America and outside the English-speaking world. So Italy, also Germany, where the Westerns of Karl May were enormously popular for many decades, and many other European countries as well. There were a lot of Western movies made in what was then the communist bloc, movies which tended not to be seen outside of the communist bloc, but were quite popular within it. And they obviously had a sort of a propaganda purpose. You know, they were partly about sort of how awful America was. So it's not as So it's sort of it's kind of fitting and not sort of unusual to have an Italian person who's interested in Westerns and wanted to do their own. This game book basically uses the standard Fighting Fantasy rules with some additions and omissions. The omission is it doesn't use luck, which is quite unique. And I've said in a previous video that it seems like a lot of people don't like the way that luck works in Fighting Fantasy, which is that luck is an attribute that your character has. So there are luckier characters and unluckier characters. And luck is sort of a resource that runs out, because when you test your luck reduces. So the idea of your luck running out or being on a lucky streak, but then your luck's going to turn or something, these are sort of objective facts in most Fighting Fantasy. It is objectively the case that there's such a thing as being lucky and being unlucky. And of course, that strikes modern people as sort of somewhat absurd. We know that, well, luck is just the name that we give to whether we desire outcomes that happen that are beyond our control. It's not a thing that we have. But ancient and medieval people would have been very comfortable with this idea of luck. The Old Norse word for luck, I believe, sorry, the Old Norse word for lucky is the same as the word for happy. Apparently because they believed that there wasn't much you could do to determine whether you'd be happy or sad. It was really just sort of what your fate was. And a lot of other people had very similar ideas about the fates, or God or the gods or someone sort of determines whether your life is going to be good or bad. And that is luck, or the lack of it. So I personally think that it is very appropriate for the normal setting of fighting fantasy, which is, it's a fantasy world. It's probably most like medieval Europe, except that sort of magic and the gods are demonstrably real things. That seems like a world where there would be luck and the lack of it. But we should remember that even in the modern world, lots of people still believe in this sort of older idea of luck. You often read, it wouldn't be at all unusual to read about an athlete who has some sort of superstition. Like, whenever I take a free throw, I always touch this medallion that I have, or something like that, and you might think it was a bit silly and it didn't work, but you wouldn't be shocked to hear that happens. And that's modern educated people. That's modern people who've been to modern schools in the first world, in the developed world. I guess the first world's probably an old expression now, but and it seems like whenever people are in situations where they feel like what happens to them is out of control, they do develop this idea of there's luck and there's bad luck, and you can sort of affect it by, with various sort of magical, or superstitious things you can do. You must do this to avoid bad fortune. If this happens, you have to do this, and if you don't, then you'll have bad luck, And certainly a person in the Old West who was living a violent life, which isn't everyone in the Old West. The Old West wasn't a sort of free-for-all of everyone shooting at each other in the way that, we sometimes think. The gunfight at the OK Corral happened, or at least the triggering incident was that one of the sides were wearing their guns in town, and it was illegal to have your guns in town. And so the other side, who were the sheriff and sort of people associated with them, went to disarm them. Although it was actually the culmination of a sort of conflict that had been going on a long time. But the point is that there was a town in the Old West, and in fact a sort of iconic town in the Old West, which had quite strict gun control. There were no guns. Well, you weren't allowed to go out in public with guns in town anyway. So the Old West wasn't as violent as we might think, but there certainly were people who were living violent lives. There were certainly outlaws. There were certainly sheriffs. Sometimes the sheriffs and the outlaws overlapped a bit more than we think. Certainly that's true in the case of the Earps, the people involved in the gunfight at the OK Corral. They were at other times pretty much outlaws. There were people who got involved in feuds, either feuds between sort of groups of friends or gangs or something, but sometimes feuds between different families, although that seems to have been less common in the West as such, if only because a lot of people were alone, and so there weren't those sort of family structures to get sucked into these feuds. But there were people living by violence, and there were people who died by violence, and you can imagine them thinking of their luck as a sort of real quality that they had, in the same way that they have, a blood type or a particular colour of eyes. They have good luck or bad luck, and their luck can run out, and so on. And certainly westerns have, the ones that I've seen have taken this up. There's a lot of musing about sort of, you can never, you're never really safe. It doesn't matter if you're the best draw in the West, you can still have a bad day, you can still be unlucky, and one day your number's up. Somewhere there's a bullet with your name on it. That sort of thing, this sort of fatalism and this idea of fate and luck seem to have been quite common in both the real West and the fictional West. So it's surprising to me that he chose to get rid of luck and to have only skill and stamina. But that's what he did. I think you could even have gotten rid of stamina in a Western. I think you could make an argument that your hit points, the points that you need to keep track of and that fall to zero when they run out, that should be your luck, not really your stamina. And in the fiction of the game, your luck going down would be bullets that nearly missed you, or they clipped your ear hole, or they should have got you, but you luckily you had a whiskey flask in your jacket and it bounced off that or something like that. And then when you get to zero, well, your luck's run out, and that was the bullet that killed you. That feels like, of course, there are different Westerns, and of course, different Westerns have different, views of the world and stuff. But from the Westerns that I've seen, and admittedly, I'm not a big fan of them or anything. I mean, I've never seen a John Ford Western, to my knowledge. I don't think I've ever seen a John Wayne starring Western. So, I've hardly sort of explored the canon. But the ones that I have seen seem to use luck as a really sort of central and important idea. They might not call it luck, but sort of fate or your numbers up, or, the idea that you can't really determine what's going to happen to you. That seems to be quite central to them a lot of the time. But he went with stamina. It's mechanically it's perfectly fine. You have a choice of 2 out of 5 skills. I think I probably chose the best ones. It seems like some of them are better than others. It uses a code word system. All that means is that in some game books you have particular choices, and then later it'll say, if earlier you spoke to the shopkeeper, then go to this paragraph, or if you didn't, then go here. And code words is a better way of doing that. What it will do is instead of giving you the option to talk to the shopkeeper and then later asking you if you have, because you might not remember, and because you might go, well, hang on, was that guy a shopkeeper? I mean, technically he was a barkeep, but is that a shop? Is that what they mean? And you might not be 100% sure if they're referring to the same thing. Well, what you can do instead is you say, if you choose to talk to the shopkeeper, go to such and such paragraph, and that paragraph, it tells you, write down the code word such and such. And then later on, it won't say, did you talk to the barkeep, or did you talk to the shopkeeper? It will say, do you have the code word such and such? And that is good, because you're always writing down the things you're meant to write down. Whereas you're not going to necessarily write down, I spoke to the shopkeeper. You're not going to necessarily know that's something you meant to remember. And it is also something that can get confusing if you play the same game more than once. You go, well, I did speak to the shopkeeper, but was that this time? Or this time did I decide to go around the town because I, da-da-da-da-dum. And also because sometimes it could be a bit ambiguous. In the example that I gave, there could be more than one shop. And, are they talking about the one just then, or are they talking about the one, in the previous town or something like that? So that's a good system. I approve of that system. I think it's pretty good. Really, the main other change is that bullets do the roll of a die +3 damage. So your stamina goes down, and the stamina of your opponents, if you're engaging in gunfights, stamina will go down a lot more quickly than it normally will in a fighting fantasy where the default is that it's 2 damage per wound. And it's a bit more realistic, but it's still, you can still sort of take 3 or 4 bullets and be fine. And that's not really true. You know, if you have, I mean, you can get nicked 3 or 4 times. You can have a bullet sort of clip your ear or you know, graze your skin or something like that. But if you're actually hit and wounded with 3 or 4 bullets, you're not fine. You know, you're probably dead or gonna bleed to death fairly soon, unless you're very, very lucky. So it makes it more realistic, but it still doesn't quite achieve realism. And I guess that was one of my thoughts, one of the reasons that made me think of that idea of having luck as your stamina, because then you can explain it as, well, the other bullets were near misses. They should have hit you, but the guy's aim was off, or for whatever reason you escaped what seemed to be death. And then the last bullet, that went through your forehead. That was the one that got you, sort of thing. I don't know. I don't mind that unrealism. It's very difficult to deal with bullets with a hit point system, because you make them sort of do a low damage, and then it's not like they're bullets. It's more like they're, I don't know, being hit with a club or something. Although even being 3 or 4 solid hits with a club would probably kill you as well. And if you make it too high, then it's just, well, 1 bullet kills you, and what's the point of having stamina? You might as well just say, if a bullet hits you, you die. If that's, you know, and that's probably more realistic than having hit points. But then there are reasons to not want to have that, because you don't want the main character to die just from the fact that the other guy rolled well at a particular time. So, you know, it's a problem that I don't have a solution for, I guess. But what they went with, which is, well, bullets do, you know, fairly substantial damage, but not necessarily realistically high damage, is probably, maybe it's the best thing that can be done. You get a little bit of a choice. You can have a gun that's more likely to hit, or you can have a gun that does extra damage. There's a small change, which is that normally when you roll against your skill in Fighting Fantasy, you roll 2 dice, and if it's equal to or under your skill, then you have succeeded. And if it's over, you've failed. What they do in this is it has to be under your skill to succeed, and if it's equal or over, you fail. And I would guess that the reason for that is because you can have a skill of 12, because the skill is your skill is determined in the normal way, which is roll a die and add 6. So if you roll a 6, you have a skill of 12, and of course you will always roll equal to or under 12 on 2 dice. So perhaps they thought, well, we don't want someone to hit, we don't want someone whose shots literally never miss, because we want the tension of rolling. So therefore it has to be under. But because you can choose a gun that is more accurate, well, that means you can still be in a position where you always hit, if you have a skill of 12. So if that was the intention, they sort of, the other option that they gave you kind of you know, stops them achieving the aim that they want to achieve. The illustrations, I would say, are amateurish. I did not like the illustrations. The composition of the illustrations was better than the execution of the illustrations. What I mean by that is the perspective all looks about right, and it's laid out in a way that a professional picture is and amateur pictures often aren't. So the action is sort of in the center. It's easy to see the focus of what's happening. There's some nice sort of symmetry and a nice asymmetry. There's nice sort of crowded spaces and blank, you know, and white spaces. In most of the pictures, the composition looks quite good, but the execution is quite bad, which suggests that maybe the pictures were like either traced or copied from other pictures. But that's purely a guess. That's just me. I don't have any reason for thinking that. That's just me, or I don't have any evidence that that's what happened. I'm just going off the fact that the execution of the pictures isn't as good as the composition of the pictures. There is a minor flaw that I would point to, which is something that I've seen in other game books, both professional and amateur, and that is that you at one point you prepare for this journey, and it gives you a long list of all this equipment that you're going to take with you, including a certain amount of supplies, a certain amount of food, and a certain amount of money. And food and money are often something you need to keep track of in game books. But it doesn't tell you which, if any, of these things you're meant to keep track of. So it says, you have a change of clothes. I can't remember exactly, but so it might say you have a change of clothes, but I thought, well, yeah, am I meant to write down that I have a change of clothes, or is that just flavour? I eventually wrote down that I wrote down the money, I think, and I didn't write down the food. I thought I'd just remember that. But it turns out, it seems that you don't need to keep track of any of it. It's just flavour. But if you're sort of genre savvy, you would probably know money and rations. That they are things that get consumed, and they are things that will matter. So I should write them down, but then they're not telling me to. So I don't like that ambiguity. I think if it's not needed, it would be better to just say you prepare for the journey and avoid the ambiguity. The story is sort of you're the sheriff of a small town. It has a quite long backstory for you. It doesn't sort of start with you it doesn't do that thing of having you as being a blank character, so that the player can sort of project themselves on you. You have a specific name and a specific family history. You grew up here. It tells you all that. You came into town, you become a rancher, you became the town marshal, etc., etc. I thought that was okay. I thought that was pretty interesting. It didn't take me out of sort of identifying with the character. I think partly because that history and stuff doesn't really come up. It's really just sort of flavour. It doesn't really influence the story. Other people might, have a problem with it. If you're female, you might sort of find it, less easy to deal with it, to identify with a character who is specifically a male. I don't know. But yeah, I thought it was good. The history, the backstory was quite interesting, seemed quite plausible. Most of the story seems historically pretty accurate. I'm not an expert on the period or anything, but there wasn't anything glaring that sort of went, no, that's not what an Old West sheriff would do or something. It all seemed quite good. It seemed like he was naming sort of specific towns. Well, I know the specific towns. One of them is fictional, but it seemed plausible. Another one is a real town. It refers to Cheyenne, which is a real place and did exist during the Old West and was sort of part of the West at the time. It mentions sort of institutions, like there's a club of sort of big cattlemen. It mentions cattle drives and stuff that seem real. So the author has either done their homework or they're good at coming up with making up plausible sounding stuff. The plot is surprisingly detective-like. You spend a lot of time trying to sort of find out where these outlaws. You're a sheriff and you're trying to track down these outlaws. I don't think that's a spoiler. And that involves a surprising amount of detective work, which makes sense. That's what a sheriff is. A sheriff is a police officer. But it's not genre. It doesn't seem to be what we're interested in terms of making westerns. There aren't really westerns where someone's tracking down outlaws and that involves talking to contacts and sort of making guesses about where these guys will be and stuff. So it was sort of surprising. It's not bad. It's not bad, but it was kind of. It wasn't. It sort of did stray outside of the genre, and I feel like if you're making a western, then that's probably because you want to make something that's in the genre of a western, right? It can be a sort of critique of that genre or something, but it's still you still want to sort of follow the tropes, and so it sort of felt to me like while the things you were doing weren't uninteresting or anything, just in terms of sort of sticking to making it a western, it would have been better to have more, tracking them through the wilderness or something like that. That's that's a thing that seems to happen in westerns a lot, or trying to sneak up on them, or finding out if you did detective stuff. You could do sort of detective stuff, but you'd want to interject other genre conventions in there, like this guy's only going to talk to you if he needs money, and he's only going to need money if he loses at poker, and so you have to beat him in a poker game, right? And so playing poker, which is a Western trope, and a thing that happened in real life, but poker wasn't as ubiquitous in the Old West as we have decided. So you get to sort of do the trope, and you also get to do the detective stuff, which the author is obviously interested in, I guess. Or you talk to a cynical prostitute, which is another part of the Old West. And by the way, you might say, well, obviously we can't have a cynical prostitute, James. This is a story for kids. No, Fighting Fantasine is made by adults. It's people who played the games when they were kids, probably. But it's mainly for an adult audience. And this story acknowledges the existence of prostitution anyway, so specifically. So that's not an objection. So yeah, I would have liked to have seen it be more tropey, I guess. There are things that happen in westerns that don't happen in this. You don't ever play poker. You don't ever stare someone down. There's no moment where your eyes lock as you stand in a deserted street and who's gonna blink first for some reason makes a difference as to who's gonna win the gunfight. Doesn't make any sense, but it happens in every western, or at least in a lot of them. That's a thing I would have liked to have seen. It does have a gunfight on a moving train. This is the end bit of the story, which is a bit of a shame because you often, and this is a bit of a problem with the game book format, which is, well, I guess you want the best bit to be the finale and the climax, but it's quite likely that you won't, on any given play of the game, you won't get to the finale or the climax. You'll die beforehand, or just sort of in this particular case, the trail goes cold and you can't find them. So there's a sort of dilemma there. What do you do if you put it in early? Well, then the best bit's early, and then the rest of it's a bit of a disappointment. And if you put it in late, then you run the risk of it not appearing in any given run of the game. And if you say, well, what I'll do is I'll make sure that the person gets to the end, well, then why have the beginning at all? I said, perhaps there's a way to do it. Perhaps there's a way of saying you're definitely going to get to the end, but the decisions you make beforehand will affect what happens at the end. Maybe. But yeah, it is a dilemma. They went with having it at the end. And that was good because I did cheat a little bit. I did one run where I didn't succeed, and then I went back and made another choice and did succeed. So on that run, I did get to the final, and I guess it's a 200 paragraph story, so it's not like there's sort of hours of gameplay to wade through to get to this finale. But so maybe it's fine in a smaller game book like this one to have a finale, because if people are at all interested in it, I guess they'll probably get to the finale within 3 or 4 plays anyway. So, but in a longer game, that is a problem. But yeah, so he decided to have what the finale is a gunfight on a moving train. I think that's the finale every time. I think it would be difficult, given the size of it, to have anything else happen. And that's pretty good. I won't say too much about how it happens, but it's a sort of it's a Western style gunfight, and it was pretty good. And that is most of what I have to say about Six Gun Friday. The departures from the core rules are a mixture of things that I liked and didn't like. I certainly think having the choice of skills was a good idea. I certainly think having the code words was a good idea. I think getting rid of luck wasn't, and then I think maybe some of the way that they dealt with bullets flying, being the main way that people fight each other in Westerns, rather than sort of sword blows, was mixed, with an acknowledgement that it's pretty difficult to have a perfect answer to that problem. And I quite liked the story. I don't feel like I wasted my time. I would have liked to have seen more tropes. I would have liked more things, more tropey things to happen. I guess that's my criticism of it. But it is free, and you can download it along with the rest of the magazine and along with other issues of the magazine. There are quite a few issues. It doesn't seem to be actively being produced anymore, but they did make quite a few, and they have quite a lot of little either game books, and then they seem to have role-playing scenarios as well for fighting fantasy. So if you're interested in that, go to their website. I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.